Hey everybody, today I'll be trying something a little bit different. Normally, whenever I do a sword video, I write out a script, do a fair amount of research into the history side, and just kind of regurgitate what I can remember from whatever YouTube videos I've watched or articles that I've read, and then talk as much as I can about my experience with the sword. That's quite a time consuming process, and over the course of the last few years, I've developed an extensive backlog of swords that I would like to talk about or need to talk about in some cases. In other cases, I've sort of decided not to really do a longer video on a lot of swords that I've gotten just because I don't really have that much to say about them. That said, occasionally I get questions about them in the comments, and because they see them in the background here. But also, I think as the sword collecting and using community grows, particularly on YouTube, but I think just in general, and as the reproduction market expands and becomes more popular, I think having some extra data points out there for people to refer to would be helpful. It's something that coming from the shooting hobby that I saw a lot of in how people would document changes in series of different guns over the years, or as companies bought them out and they changed hands and production changed and moved to different factories and so on, that different revisions, different versions were noted, and all of these little changes were noted. So that's not something I feel like that I've seen a lot of in the sword community. I'm not saying that it exists, it doesn't exist, but yeah, it's not something I've seen much of. So I think having any kind of video on a sword, even if it's just a general overview, would help current and future collectors know what a sword looked like at any given time, or how it changed over the course of the years, particularly as companies get bought out, like I said, or as production changes to different factories. So the first sword that I'm going to talk about in this series is this sword from Cold Steel. I'm going to have to pull my notes out because it's kind of got a long name here. Ribbed Shell Swept Hilt Rapier. This is actually the third sword that I ever bought, and I bought this sword back when I was doing more collecting, before I really even knew that people used swords for things like cutting practice and martial arts. It was more just to buy swords of a certain particular type. The only thing that I knew at the time was to get something called Battle Ready, and didn't really pay any other attention to or really even understand anything about dimensions and steels and all that. Of course, I've learned a lot over the last 3 or 4 years now that I've been buying swords since I bought this sword. So what we have here is an advertised weight of 48 ounces, which is 3 pounds, and an overall length of 50.5 inches, made of 1060 carbon steel. And as you can tell, maybe can tell, I'm not sure how much you can see on the camera, this is quite a long sword, particularly for a one-handed sword. As far as I'm aware, I don't often see one-handed swords with a 50-inch overall length. Now, balancing-wise, though, it balances pretty close to the hilt, and that's mainly because there's just not much blade out here. The blade's very thin and quite tapered. So, the reason why I have not done a video on this sword previously is because this is a dedicated thrusting sword. It will not cut. I've tried to cut with it, it does not cut. The cross section here is just entirely too thick to actually cut anything with. Now, before someone says, well, it's a rapier, they're meant for thrusting, what'd you expect? No, I thrusting. Like, I agree. It is a thrusting sword, but I also don't do a lot of backyard thrusting. I mainly am a backyard cutter, as in I cut bottles and such to Tommy mats whenever I can get them, and pool noodles and such with the swords that I use. So I don't really use the sword very much. I mainly bought it again from the collector aspect because I felt like I needed a rapier. I also think that whenever I was looking at reviews, I may have been looking at reviews for the Cavalier Rapier, which has a shorter blade, and if I had to do it over again, that's probably the one I would have convinced my past self to get, although I'm probably not going to get a lot of dedicated thrusting swords from now on. So, some observances about this sword. If you're here looking for something approaching a review, though I wouldn't necessarily call this a review. Again, I mentioned the length. It feels quite long for a sword. I don't know enough about rapiers to be able to tell you how typical this is or if that's a good thing or not, but it does feel pretty heavy to try to swing around. Point control, though, is pretty easy because of, again, the balance back here in the handle. The handle is pretty long. You can see how much overhang there is whenever I've got my finger up over the knuckle bow. I will say, just hit my ceiling, I will say that these little sharp edges down here around where the knuckle bow is and all that are very sharp. Not so sharp that I think I would end up cutting myself, but it's definitely going to wear on the skin, bite into the skin over time. And really the worst aspect of it, from a comfort standpoint, is just that these little wire pieces are very, very pokey into this. I think they say ray skin, it may be genuine. I'm not convinced it is. It's pretty hard, which means it could be ray skin. But that wire wrap is really uncomfortable to use without any kind of hand protection or gloves or and so on. So, the other thing that I've noticed too is that I've described it as rattly. I've really only noticed it whenever I actually did try cutting bottles with it a few times just to see if it would, knowing it probably wouldn't. But you can hear how much noise there is. I think that's just because of this really ornate, I'm guessing it's a mild steel guard. I can kind of move the guard a little bit with my hand. So it's not the most solid feeling thing. It is pretty whippy, which I'm not sure I can even get my hand low enough to show you. But again, I'm also not sure how typical that is for rapiers. I think rapiers tend to be pretty flexible. I think some tend to be a little over flexible. This feels relatively rigid for as thin as the blade is. Again, I think due to that pretty that cross section there. I think that's considered a hollow grind through here with this fuller here, or maybe it's considered double fullered. I'm not really sure. Someone can certainly in the comments can correct me on that. So it also comes with the scabbard. It looks like it's got some kind of polymer. I think that's pretty typical for cold steel, is to have a polymer core or plastic core with leather wrapping. And so nothing particularly special or anything like that. But again, I'm always grateful whenever a company includes a scabbard that is at least there to act as some kind of protection for the blade in transport. But yeah, even just holding this thing right now and moving this around while I'm talking about it is pretty uncomfortable on the hands. So not something I would necessarily recommend. I don't think it's necessarily an awful sword, but it's definitely not one that I will really ever use, and will probably be among the first of my collection that I sell to make room whenever I get to a point where I'm actually doing that. If I had to do it over again, I would get a different rapier, I think. Yeah, so really easy to accidentally hit stuff with this thing because, again, it's just so long. So that's my experience with the cold steel, whatever this thing is called, ribbed shell swept hilt rapier. Again, the third sword that I ever bought for myself. The first was the Noble Plants Gin, the next sword was this arming sword back here, Templar arming sword by Windlass, which I will also do a video on at some point in the future, and then this rapier. So yeah, I'm going to push on and do a few more of these short little videos here. I hope it was enjoyable or useful, or at least not terribly dull for you. And if you haven't yet, please subscribe to my channel. You'll see more of these here in the near future. And hope you all are doing well. I'll talk to you later.